Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's panel webinar on insider attacks. My name is Holger Schulze, and I will be your moderator today. Now it is my pleasure to introduce today's panel of cybersecurity experts with a combined 32+ years of insider threat experience. First, I would like to introduce Rob Kerr, Chief Technology Officer at Haystacks. Welcome, Rob.
Hi, Holger. Just a little bit of background about me. I've been with Haystacks since the very beginning. In the last 10 years or so, we've been doing insider threat work almost exclusively. And my role here at the firm is to help build our product and work with R&D and some of our most challenging customers to deliver our best solutions.
Excellent. Thank you, Rob. Next, I would like to welcome Mike Kraus, Senior Director of Insider Threat Solutions at Forcepoint. Welcome, Mike.
Thanks, Holger. Appreciate it. And thank you to Haystacks for inviting me to participate in this panel. I'm bringing over roughly around 15 years of insider threat experience of working all facets of insider threat program, from the planning stages, kind of the early on, to even the operational aspects of the insider threat program. You know, executing insider threat programs, understanding the effect and impact it is on an organization, on the employees, you know, and also being able to do kind of effective, thorough investigations. So I welcome this panel. I'm looking forward to it. And once again, thanks again for inviting me. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Welcome, Mike. Next, I would like to welcome Thomas Reed. Thomas is the Vice President of Security Analytics at Haystacks Technology. Welcome, Tom.
Thanks very much, Holger. It's a pleasure to be here talking to you, and I'm looking forward to this discussion. At Haystacks, I've been at Haystacks for about a year and a half. I lead the security analytics practice at Haystacks, which insider threat falls under. And before that, I worked quite intensely with the Army on helping set up their insider threat program. So hopefully I can bring some of these lessons learned to this panel.
Excellent. Thank you, Tom. And again, my name is Holger Schulze, and some of you may know me from the 360,000 member information security community that I manage on LinkedIn. Now, today's webinar focuses on, well, insider threats. Over the next hour or so, we will review the key findings of the latest insider threat report based on a survey of over 500, cybersecurity professionals. And more importantly, we will, discuss best practices and lessons learned in both, the private sector and government space, complete with real-world practical steps on how to implement a successful insider threat program, and also how user behavior analytics can be used to anticipate insider attacks and stop them in their tracks. At the end of the webinar, we'll provide free copies of supporting materials, including the Insider Attacks survey, the ebook, as well as 2 white papers with practical steps on security analytics and insider threats. Now, let's dive right into the survey results from our insider threat survey. One of the first questions we asked was, what type of insider threats are you most concerned about? And looking at the chart, we see that malicious data breaches are high on the list of insider threats that organizations are most concerned about, in addition to negligent data breaches and inadvertent data breaches. And because malicious threats are typically premeditated and intended to do damage, it becomes vitally important to predict and preempt these threats, wherever possible. Now, I'm going to start taking some questions from our audience and direct them to our panel. And this first question is for Rob. And the question is, in addition to malicious data breaches, which we see represented in the top 3 responses, and also that are widely reported, publicly, are there other kinds of insider threats that organizations should be concerned about? Rob?
Thank you, Holger. Yeah, absolutely. As you mentioned, all three of these are data-related items, but there are other kinds of threats that you ought to be concerned about from an insider perspective. One of the ones that we see a lot is malicious use of company resources or access that you might gain through an organization. Some examples there would be a rogue trader that could cause massive losses for a financial services organization. And we hear about these in the news from time to time. These ultimately can materially impact an organization. There's another example a few years back with Arthur Andersen, where you had folks failing to follow organizational policy and procedure, which ultimately resulted in the loss of the firm. You look outside of the commercial sector and into the public sector, you see malicious intent to harm when some of the shootings that have occurred in organizations like the DoD. So all of these are things that go above and beyond just data breach, but still fall into what I would consider to be an insider threat category. One thing that's interesting here is this notion of inadvertent versus negligent versus malicious. It's a good breakdown of a category of issues, specifically because it speaks to intent. And a lot of the way we look at insider is intent related. And so it's important when you're thinking about an insider threat program to think about ways that you can get to intent or understand intent of actions, because it's going to help you understand how you can prepare for or prevent or mitigate and respond to an event when something happens.
Very good. Great examples and great advice. Thank you, Rob. Now, next, we asked our survey participants what user groups, pose the largest security risk to organizations. And not surprisingly, it is the privileged IT users, right, such as administrators with access to sensitive information that pose the biggest insider threat. And this is closely followed by contractors and consultants. And then number three, regular employees. Let me pick another question, and this one I think is for Mike. Mike, everyone seems to agree that privileged users represent the greatest risk. But as companies expand, their mobile workforce, how can companies gain visibility into how employees are accessing company data, while not sitting behind company walls? Mike?
Yes, thanks, Holger. One of the things that we first need to understand that there's no silver bullet. There's no technical silver bullet. There's no process silver bullet. There's no program silver bullet that makes this problem easy. But there are steps to mitigate the risk. There are steps to actually take for each company. One of the things you should do initially is, how do you flow down your policies, procedures, and technology, for example, into supply chain? How do you flow down that same policies, procedures, monitoring techniques to contractors? Because one of the we've seen is that one of the greatest risks, besides even the privileged users, is organizations that have contractors that are accessing information. They could be accessing classified information through a different portal. They could be accessing IP information into a company's database. So being able to flow down those policies and procedures that are vetted from a company to a contractor to supply chain, I think is one of your first steps to have consistent monitoring, consistent processes. One of the things that Rob said about intent, I think one of the ways we need to determine intent and to protect the privacy of individuals is if we can gather the context of information, because the context of information will make it very important to determine if somebody's being malicious or non-malicious. And you can protect the privacy of the individual because you have the context about how they're operating. So being able to flow down those policies, procedures, potentially technology, will be a way to expand your visibility across both the mobile force and contractors and employees.
Great recommendations. Thank you, Mike. Now, next, we asked our survey participants, why do they see a rise in insider attacks? And our research shows that there are two factors, right? One is on the motivation side of things. For example, a desire by insiders to monetize sensitive data, such as social security numbers, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And the other side is about weaknesses in corporate IT environments that can be exploited, right, and that make organizations more vulnerable to insider attacks. And one of the key issues here that comes up again as one of the key reasons why insider threats are on the rise are insufficient data protection strategies and solutions. That and the proliferation of sensitive data moving outside the firewall on mobile devices. We have a question on that topic, and I'd like to ask Tom, what are the root causes, if you will, for this increase in attacks? You know, is it an array of technology? Is it an expanded attack surface? Tom?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So when I look at these numbers, the survey numbers, the first thing I reacted to was how close they are actually, in identifying what key drivers might be the reason for increasing insider attacks. And when I was looking at this, I was thinking to myself, well, are they, we need to unpack this a little bit, I think. And the first way I would do that is to ask the question, are they actually increasing? And even that information that you would get about the increase is a little bit muddled. In some cases they are. It says that they are. We've had facts on that. But in other cases, there are actually just only certain types of insider attacks are increasing, some of the bigger ones, for example. Then I wanted to understand, well, given this, given whether or not they're truly increasing or if they are actually slowing down a little bit because of all the protection that we have on it, I wanted to look at whether or not, some of the things that we're currently doing are actually reducing the increase in attacks. So I was looking into that. But ultimately, to answer your question on the three root causes, I would say that number one is it's almost out of our control, but it's the increase in interconnectivity and vulnerabilities. The interconnectivity piece is well known. Everyone understands that, the Internet of Things and so on, increasing the attack surface. The other one, though, is maybe not thought of as much, which is the increase in vulnerabilities. I'm thinking of, for example, the OPM breach last year, or 2 years ago. The Chinese essentially have, our SF-86, our security clearance forms. They have millions of these. That will increase our vulnerabilities because they know who, might be more susceptible to bribery and coercion. So that's something that is not necessarily in our control. And then the third one I would say is interesting also. It's sort of this changing culture. There's an interesting data point here which suggests that, the millennials, for example, they switch jobs quite often. Somewhere around 50% of people who actually switch jobs are taking data with them. So that is another piece where we're basically losing data and information at huge numbers that we can't even sort of stop or we can't keep track of. So those are some of the big root causes for why this is happening, I think. Another couple that are really within our control, and that is, I think a lot of us have the wrong focus. We've talked a lot about the network and endpoint detection. One of the areas that we're not focusing on, and we've seen some very high-profile incidents recently, that if we had focused on some of these areas, we might have stopped. And that is, on the personal security side or HR side, picking up behaviors before you get on the network. Harold Martin, for example, the NSA, there was very little that we might have picked up on the network. He was, authorized to use to take information down from the network. He wasn't authorized to walk out with it, which is what he did. But there were behaviors beforehand. There were, DUIs. There was tax fleeing. There were a whole number of incidents that his security clearance process should have been able to see and stop. So we need to think more holistically about how we address these problems. And then the final one is just the general sort of human nature of responding to threats. And this, to me, is very interesting. There are a couple cases in which the individuals who committed an insider threat were so they were not trusted. They were so ingrained in their work. They were, uniquely qualified to do a job that nobody wanted to remove them, even when they did some, nefarious bad things. So you knew that they were going to be a problem, but at the same time, human nature would say, well, you know what, let's just see if, he's so important to the job, we just got to keep him in there. And that, to me, is something that, might be resolved by an external fact-based view rather than keeping the internal chain of command in charge. But, all of these things are very difficult to solve. But I found those to be some of the interesting pieces.
Yeah, they are interesting. I like in particular your emphasis on taking a holistic view, right, and looking at behaviors of individuals. And this is actually, this root cause question and concerns about the increase in attacks. That's a popular question. So I see it popping up here in our Q&A window. So if I can, let me open up this question to our panel. Any other comments? Any other advice that you guys would like to add?
Yeah, this is Rob Kerr. I would thank you, Tom. I think those were some great examples. But I would add just a few more things in just reacting to that. I think organizations are increasingly exposed because of the way things are happening. I'll explain what I mean. And so as a result, you're seeing more attacks. And I see two trends that are sort of driving this exposure. So the first is more and more we're seeing firms rely on IT systems for critical operations. And, before where these were departmental services or departmental packages, we're finding organizations putting more and more into data lakes, into aggregated data stores. And so as a result, you see more opportunity for an insider to substantially impact an organization when they decide that that's something that they want to do. And you couple that with this other trend that's happening right now in industry, and that is this increasingly mobile and distributed workforce. More and more you have organizations that have people not just at headquarters, but also spread at offices throughout the country, or even at remote offices where they may only be the only employee. And there are large organizations that are structured this way. It's better quality of life for their employees. It helps save on office costs. But at the same time, for that arrangement to work, these organizations now are exposing core business systems to personnel over these remote links. And obviously, there's the security concerns associated with that. But from an insider perspective, these remote personnel are more easily marginalized by the distributed work environment. They don't have all the support systems and all the other things that you would use or look at in an organization to know, is this person becoming disaffected? And so when they decide to take action, there's lots more opportunity for them to do so.
Excellent. Thank you, Rob. Now, going back to the motivational aspect of our insider threats, our research shows that the desire by insiders to, for example, monetize sensitive data such as social security numbers, that desire is the biggest number one factor, right, motivating insider attacks, followed by, fraud and things like sabotage by disgruntled employees, as Rob just mentioned. I would like to ask the next audience question, or direct the next audience question to Mike. The question is, besides dollars, what are some other underlying motivations for employees to actually steal from a company or commit sabotage or fraud? Are these motivations easy to detect, or do they represent an opportunity to almost falsely accuse employees? Mike?
Sure. This is a tough question to answer from a motivation point of view, or actually a detection point of view. Motivation I can answer pretty quickly. From a detection point of view, I'm going to go back to what Rob and Tom had said. I believe it's easier to detect if you're bringing in those external indicators, those external data like we talked about, like HR records, personnel security records, potentially, SF-86 in a government, you're looking at financial information, potentially credit scores. So if you're able to combine that external data and using it kind of as a tipping and queuing with potentially how people are accessing information in the inside, saying how am I, what am I accessing on a daily basis? Has my accesses changed over time? Am I accessing more data this day than I did, 30 days ago? My email history, am I emailing the same type of people that I emailed, the previous 30 days? So you're looking at a profile in an individual changing over time. If you can look at those external indicators combined with the internal indicators, the technical observables, I think you increase your likelihood to be able to detect and be able to proactively kind of respond to a potential threat. But if you look at some of the motivations that are driving people, let's talk about today. I mean, it doesn't go a day we pass in the news with the President Trump and all the accusations that are going on from Congress to everybody out there, from the FBI to insider threats. I mean, if you're talking insider threats, that is on the tip of everybody's tongue lately. And one of the motivations is not money. Nobody's making a significant amount of dollars from looking at these today. They're looking at fame. You're looking at political motivations. You may be looking at other HR motivations, like trying to, take that next promotion, trying to escalate yourself into a prominent position. Those are not necessarily dollars and cents that you're going to see today, but those are motivations that drive people. So we need to really look at systems. We need to look at process and programs that can be able to kind of take a different approach. I mean, I think somebody said before about the millennials, which is kind of an interesting comment, that the millennials are actually changing the way security happens within the government and the private sector. Because the millennials and the way they access social media, the way you prescribe to security, what their interpretation of security is different from people that have been working with the government and private sector for the last 20 or 30 years. So if I'm looking at it from the holistic approach, which I think is a tremendous opportunity to help mitigate these risks, you need to look at all type of motivations, from monetary to political motivations to HR motivations to workplace disgruntlement, anything that's going to affect somebody's psyche, somebody's ability to take and change their personality to grab information.
Excellent. Thank you, Mike. The next question that we asked in our survey was, whether organizations leverage analytics to determine insider threats. And it turns out that the number of organizations that, use insider threat analytics is growing quite rapidly, up 20% compared to the previous year. And let me take one audience question related to this topic and ask Tom. The question is, can you please define user behavior analytics and predictive analytics and give some examples?
Yeah, no, this is a great question, and hopefully my colleague Rob and Mike can also help on this, because it's very big in the business right now. User behavior analytics, essentially, that looks at the pattern of user behavior, then applies analytics to detect anomalies from those patterns. I mean, that's the simplest way of looking at it. Generally speaking, the user is the user of the network, but in reality, the user could be the user of other things, as long as you're being able to collect that the information that you need to detect these anomalies. There are a lot of user behavior analytics technologies firms out there. Forcepoint, for example, is one. In some ways, Haystacks is. We have slightly different focus, but essentially anyone who's looking at the user versus the the data itself. So that's one. That's the user behavior analytics. The predictive analytics, to me, is more of a differentiator. Predictive analytics is basically, as it suggests, taking current info that you have, current evidence, and to predict about future events. But the reality of it is even more interesting, and I'll give you an example. So in the Haystack, the way that Haystacks works with its models, we have a model where you could take data evidence in, and say you find out that you see that somebody has had a DUI on their record, and that that evidence is plugged into your model, right? And so you have 100%. That person has 100% chance in your model that they had a DUI. So that's easy. We've detected that you have a DUI. What's more interesting is that with the model, the probabilistic model we have on whole person behavior, that DUI can impact say the likelihood that you will commit a fraud based on the fact that people who have DUIs generally are people who thwart the law, or they ignore the law, or they think they're above the law. I mean, there are certain behaviors associated with the DUI, whether it's likelihood to commit fraud or likelihood to do something else. And what helps with our customers is that they can see what actually happened and they can take action, but then they can also prepare for what might happen with a caveat that they know that there's a good chance that it won't. But at least they can look at their employees with a different lens. They're now looking at them more broadly, and they're trying to see if they can identify things that will prove or disprove that hypothesis that they commit fraud. So those are kind of the two differences. Anyone else like to talk more about it? Be open for that on the panel.
Well, I would kind of reiterate what Tom was saying and talk about something that Mike has mentioned: context. There are a lot of systems that are detecting network events that are generating lots of alerts, and oftentimes too many alerts. And the natural reaction to that is to try to tamp that down and try to get to the right alerts. And so you're looking at what feels like a filtering operation. And in our view, in my view, in Haystack's view, the right answer is actually the exact opposite. What you really want is more alerts, more triggers that give you context, because that's going to be the thing that lets you look at the ones that you see and say, is this something that I really do need to worry about? And so, in fact, the correct response is to try to gather more data and put it into an integrated picture so that you can get a broader sense from a lot of weak indicators that something, in fact, might actually be going on, rather than looking for that single silver bullet that's going to say, this is happening now, go stop it.
And I agree. I'm going to chime in real quick. No, you're correct. I think the alerts, we are just getting caught up in, presenting alerts to a cyber operation or insider threat operator. They're getting inundated with more alerts, more events, more triggers, things that they need to act upon. And a lot of those really, take away from the big problem or distract them, because they might not be as critical. They might be lower priority events. I agree with the fact that, you need to have technologies and processes in place that can collect information that's not cluttering the screen of a security operations center, not requiring them to take act of everything. I mean, it was funny. I think it was Tom who worked with the Army customer early on. Funny story. We worked with them as well early on in the process, and one of the things they brought to us with respect to kind of DLP, data leak prevention, they brought us a screen that said, hey, we have these 8,000 events that we have to act upon. And we said, well, what are these events? We don't know. We just know we have 8,000 events that we have to do something about. But they couldn't tell us what they needed to do, what was the context around the event, but they had an event, they had a screen full of events that they thought they needed to take action on, which probably, if you looked at those 8,000 events, there were probably a handful that were critical. But they didn't have the context around those specific DLP events to figure out, to prioritize which ones are important. So having that user attributed context, having that information that you can combine with the analytics like Haystacks is bringing to the table, is critical to be kind of looking at the resource efficiency and the problem in general.
Thank you. And that's the perfect segue to our next topic, which is user behavior monitoring, right? And in our survey, we asked our participants whether they monitor user behavior, in their organizations, and also if they do, what level of visibility do they have? And the survey shows that most organizations, they do indeed monitor, their user behavior one way or another. And most organizations today rely on server logs, right, to track user behavior. And only 25% of them, 25% of organizations have deployed dedicated user activity monitoring solutions. And 13% of respondents say that they have no visibility into user behavior at all. And there's a couple of questions on this, user monitoring topic. So let me pick this one. I'd like to ask Mike, with only 25% surveyed, implementing a user activity monitoring program, what are the key challenges and obstacles for companies to increase the overall visibility across their respective enterprises? Mike?
Well, the first thing I see from a big picture point of view is culture. It really comes down to culture. This is not a technology problem. I mean, this to me there's many technologies out there, from user behavior analytics to endpoint monitoring to network analysis to logs analysis with different SIMs out there. But it really comes down to culture. It really comes down to an organization's belief and an organization's understanding of what is an insider threat, how do they define insider threat, what stakeholders should be invited to the table for an organization. So if they can get through the culture part, the level of C-suite support, getting from the top down, not a bottom-up program, that's one of the first things that organizations need to come to grips with. If they can change the culture of an organization to say, you know what, we're going to actively monitor our employees because it's in our compliance statement, and that we have to then train our employees of what an insider threat is. We have to also make sure they understand that we are going to monitor their activity at work when they're accessing company information. They can start to change that culture. If they get a clear idea of the objectives of the program and articulate those goals to their employees, that would help from a first step point of view. This is not too hard of a problem. Everybody makes insider threat, UAM, user activity monitoring, like it's wow, this is hard. We can't do this. You can. They should not be scared. They just have to understand all the process to put in place, understand the procedures to put in place, and then go out and look for different technologies that will meet their needs. Don't think that you have a SIM is going to meet the needs for user activity monitoring. A SIM is a great technology for collaborating and bringing in different server logs, like network logs, router logs. But you really need to look at specific user activity monitoring technology, like endpoint monitoring, like user behavior analytics, and start to combine those technologies to give you the visibility, to give you the context, to give you the incident response, the ability to do triage on something you noticed in your environment. If you can bring all those things together in a very responsible manner, then you can start changing the culture of an organization, and then you're going to see this 25% number increase to 30, to 35%, and then hopefully by the end of next year, we'll be at 50% of companies surveyed that actually have a fully vetted user activity monitoring program in place.
Exactly. Thank you, Mike. I think you raised a couple of great points on this, what I think is an important question, right? So why don't we open this up to the entire panel and see what other examples of challenges, or more importantly, solutions we can explore. Anybody else on the panel want to chime in?
Yeah, I will. I mean, this is Rob Kerr. I absolutely agree with Mike on this one. Culture is huge. We see and work with a lot of organizations who are struggling with the idea that they can't trust their people. There's a lot about Insider that I don't want to say threatens to, but seems to threaten this idea that it's going to change the relationship between the employer and employee. I think it's not a surprise to anyone that an organization might feel like, well, if we're going to share some of our most sensitive information or secrets, there comes with that an additional level of responsibility, an additional level of monitoring that we might choose to do. And I think that's a big one for companies to get their heads around. And then it all starts to flow down. You see, from an organizational structure standpoint, a lot of times organizations, their IT departments are separate from their HR departments. As we've talked about context earlier, and this notion that Insider is often first made visible by a variety of weak indicators, and the ability to put those weak indicators together gets you an ability to see things that you might otherwise miss. So you take an employee, for example, who is coming in late or taking a number of days off on a regular basis, which in itself isn't a strong indicator, but you combine that with some network activity. Maybe they're searching around for folders and files that they're not typically supposed to go to. Again, weak indicators, but you start to put that together and you start to say, well, maybe there's something else going on here. But a lot of organizations aren't structured to share data in that way. And finding ways to do it so that you're able to get the insight that can be gained from putting it together while at the same time protecting sensitive data from, again, even their IT and HR departments is a challenge for organizations. And then the last one is it flows from this, but I see a lot of organizations who are still looking at insider threat as an IT kind of problem. And it's much, much bigger than that. By the time you see things happening on your network, it's already happening. And so really you want to start to be able to bring in more context and look outside just the network to be able to get a sense of, again, why am I seeing this kind of behavior? Or are there things going on in an employee's life inside of work or outside of work that might cause them to be more prone to be motivated to take action against us as an organization? And should we perhaps change their role or have some other kind of intervention before something bad happens?
Thank you, Rob. Thank you, Mike. That's a great segue into our next question that we explored in the survey. Yeah, so basically, what do our survey participants see as the biggest barriers, right, to better insider threat management? And it turns out the single biggest barrier is organizational, starting right with a lack of training and expertise. And rounding out the top three barriers are, in addition to training and expertise, are insufficient budgets and lack of collaboration between departments, right? Also an organizational issue. Let me ask Tom a related question that just came from our audience. Tom, what are you seeing as the biggest barriers to better insider threat program implementation and management? Tom?
Yeah, thanks. This is one of the more interesting survey results because what I did not see here, and I would have loved if I had, but I'm going to talk about it, is there was nothing in here which said that insider threat is ignored because it is not part of it's not part of the right portfolio, or it's not part of it doesn't have the right owner, or something like that. Here we talk about, the silos, which, we've heard many times, lack of budget, which is possible, driven by silos oftentimes, training and expertise, which you can talk about a little bit more, and whether or not it's a priority. But to me, one of the biggest barriers is a lack of a risk-based approach. And this is something that Haystacks hammers home a lot. And that is that if you need to take, a company needs to take insider threat as part of its risk management portfolio or risk portfolio. So as it looks across its organization and looks across its assets and, basically any kind of critical infrastructure, this includes its financials, budget, whatever it might be, everything has a risk piece to it. And insider threat is no different. And if it's worked within the context of risk, then the decisions will be different. The decisions will be based on risk. So if you say that that there are only a few of your assets that you really, really worry about, getting stolen, and there are only a few employees that you're really, really worried about, then you can prioritize how you deal with it. And so risk-based approach directly leads to prioritization and directly leads to the knowledge that everything is a trade-off. You can't stop everything. You don't have the money for it, but it's all part of that same process that's done. And, it'd be nice if there was a chief risk officer, for example, who's in charge of insider threat as being one of the risk areas. So I would say that that's, the number one thing. The number two thing, which actually I don't think we've talked about this yet, and I'm glad now's a good time. After you've detected insider threats, suppose you have a user activity monitoring and you found some hits and you want to respond to them. How do you respond? I guess Mike did actually bring this up a little bit, about not knowing how to respond. But another piece is, even if you do know exactly how to respond, what if you don't have the manpower? What if you don't have the proper process, the workflow? And even worse, what if you feel like the liability of you responding to this thing get you into more trouble? Maybe there's a way that you can hide it. And believe me, that's something that we've seen where, there's a big stack of, obviously people are doing things that are bad. And then there isn't a response process. And I could think of a million, not a million, thankfully there aren't a million, but many examples. The Manning, WikiLeaks, a lot of it was just people didn't want to interfere, or they just were hoping that it, and there were some issues involved in each of these cases. So, I guess the bottom line, those two are the big ones. And then the final one, which isn't as big, but it's still important, I think, is, organizations rely on things that they already know, even if they don't work. So this is a big obstacle. If you have a tool or technique that will actually focus on the insider threat, but the organization has a legacy systems that are doing a pretty good job, and then the system owners, the companies will say, well, we can tweak this and that and the other. They'll do that. And oftentimes it doesn't work because it's, just a different core competency. So it's hard sometimes to, show the right tool, the right process, and, when a company has invested millions and millions of dollars in a different way, which may not be as effective.
Thank you, Tom. And we couldn't have asked for a better segue to our next topic, which is right about the focus, right, on security controls and whether, organizations emphasize the right security controls, the right investments. Basically, the next question was about what controls organizations deploy, right, to combat insider threats. And in our research, we found that the security controls that these organizations most commonly utilize include things like security perimeter defense tools, right, database and file monitoring, security events, dashboards, and so on. And so with that, I'd like to ask Mike a follow-up question. The security, or the survey results rather, seem to be focused on systems, right, data and network attack vectors versus the actual users. Can you discuss the threats from, human beings and how companies can mitigate these insider threats?
Yes. So if you look at the question, it's interesting the way the question is phrased when they ask for controls. They ask for remediation. Controls to me is something that, signifies potentially looking for external threats, looking for the way to control access to systems, access to database. But if you look at it from a person point of view, and this is kind of an interesting point, and we've been trying to make this for a little bit at ForcePoint, is the fact of the only constant in security is the people. Because the technology is constantly changing and evolving. And if the humans, that's us, we are storing, we're accessing data in many different platforms. I mean, we talked about it a moment ago about removable media, the public cloud, the mobile devices we all have. We have the private cloud. If you look at that, and if you focus just on the technology, just focus on the systems out there, your problem has just quadrupled. I mean, it is becoming a rapidly out of control way to look at different perimeter tools, defense tools that are just focused on the many systems, the many access points of social engineering. But if you focus in on the person, the individual, the human, and how they interact with the data, from the way they interact through their endpoint devices, it could be a workstation, it could be a mobile machine, it could be how they're accessing through a VPN. If you combine that ability to grab that information off the pointy edge of the sword, off the endpoint that is user attributed, meaning that it doesn't point to an IP address, it doesn't point to a MAC address, it actually is to a living, breathing person. And if you combine those endpoint device information with those external indicators, we talked about badge records, potentially phone records, potentially other information, and you throw that into a user behavior analytics solution, that can look at a person's change in profile over time. And that, I think, is one of the critical things people need to understand, that insider threats, you'll catch the low-hanging fruit. You'll catch the people that do something very silly. Maybe they do it by mistake, malicious or non-malicious. But really the truly, what I call tough problems are the people that are kind of hiding in the noise, hiding amongst everybody else, that they're blending in. So you need technology combined with the processes to look for those small changes over time. And to me, that is one of the greatest things about where we're at as a community, is that we're just starting to scratch the surface. And I think you're going to see over the next 2 to 3 years, you're going to see this evolve to more machine learning, to more incident response, where you're going to take the results of user behavior analytics, you're going to kind of throw it up to the front end and do more endpoint analytics and look for that specific behavior at the pointy edge of the sword. So to me, that's kind of some of the benefits and what we'll be looking at from a human perspective. With respect to the top 3 things an executive should take away from the survey, there's a lot of good information, but what are the top 3 things that they should be taking away from the survey?
Well, so that's a great question, because the survey addressed a lot of different pieces and parts, and I think that if you listen to us discuss some of the common themes, I think probably the number one thing is prioritization of insider threats is really the only way you can go and expect to get your bang for the buck. So the money that you're spending, and then the protection you're getting. Because if you really do try to address everything, if you try to close off your network from everything, or if you try to add all the tools that there are, there's still going to slip through. And some of the biggest ones, those black swan events will still happen. So the best approach is to think in terms of, as I had said earlier, kind of this risk-based approach, which will give you to a sort of a way of prioritizing. So that's one theme. Another theme is, these are surveys of questions that we have for experts in the area or workers in the area. One thing that would be helpful is, as you're looking at those survey answers, you want to dig into the facts too. So are insider threats rising? Well, let's really understand what the facts are behind that before we, put together policies based on the survey questions. And that's what I was thinking of, is that, there could be just perceptions which aren't necessarily matched with reality, and you want to understand the situation on the ground before you actually build a program. And I don't know, somebody else help me with the third one?
Well, I'm going to jump in here. This is Mike, and then I want to get Rob on it. I have another question for Rob that popped up, but I think one of the biggest things we saw is that, there was still concern about budgets. I don't think we've ever, kicked that. It seems like that can has always been kicked down the road, is saying that, I don't think the budgets are still there for effective programs. I think everybody is starting to recognize that there's a risk, recognize what the damage could be done, but I don't think the budgets are equaling what the risk and the dollar amounts that a damage could happen. So I think one of the things that I would have liked to see in future surveys is actually starting to quantify the dollars associated with risk, so people can start kind of looking at it from a big picture point of view, saying, wow, this could cost the company X dollars, and maybe that's something each company should do to kind of do the what if scenario. What if this happened? How much it would have cost me in this year, and then maybe every year after that. So that's one of the things I take away as well.
Yeah, no, that's a big issue, I think.
To me, that starts to speak to what I would call the third takeaway, and that is analytics. This might sound a little self-serving from us at Haystacks, but one of the things about risk management is it always comes down to prioritization, security. You can always spend more money. You can always do one more thing. Mm-hmm. The real question is, given the resources that I do have, what should I focus on? And if your systems are not helping you answer that question, and if they're not helping you answer that question, then they're not doing what I would argue is perhaps one of the most critical things that you would need to be able to do in this space, because there's always going to be more things to respond to than you have time or people or budget or resources to address. And so, I would argue that the critical to any program is the ability to not only just take in information, but be able to analyze that information via analytics that are giving you a risk-based view of the results and saying, okay, if you only have time to do one thing, this is the thing. If you've got time to do two things, then do these two things, and help you organize and structure your response so that you can tailor it to the level of resource you have available.
So, Rob, to follow on with that question, because you brought it up, so I'm going to kind of blame you on this one, is that you talked about taking advantage of your resources. So what type of data sources would you consider, ideal for any analytics? Because there could be a tremendous amount of data sources available. We talked a lot about HR records. We talked about badge facility records. We talked about endpoint data. We talked about other external data. So what would you consider, the types of data sources needed to feed your analytics solution? Because, good data in will produce good results out. Bad data in is going to result in, what that will result in. So tell me a little bit about what data sources you would recommend.
So that's a really good question. I'm going to take this, and by the way, these are in no particular order, although I think a lot of organizations find this order to be useful because it's sort of ease of getting. Certainly the sort of the simplest and most obvious would be data from your IT systems. Now, I've said before that this isn't only an IT problem, but a lot of organizations are already collecting that kind of information. They've already got systems to help them analyze some of it. And so feeding that into an insider threat detection system seems like an obvious next step. From there, I would start to add in other kinds of organizational sensors. So at that point, you're thinking about not just network data, but print data, thinking about badge and access data. So they can start to get a sense of who's doing what. Again, this is a people problem, as you said, Mike. And then, start to bring in HR data. So when are people taking vacation? When are they, or when are they being sent on travel? When are they coming in late or not coming in at all? And then using that information to start to get a sense of who are people and how are they changing over time. Again, context. So that when you start to see an unusual thing happening on the network, you can start to bring additional context into it. All of those information sources are owned by the organization, so they're readily available, provided you can do the integration. But then you start to look outside the organization, and I would argue that this is a critical thing when you're talking about protecting sensitive information. Looking at public records information, understanding if someone is going through maybe a divorce, or if they're going through a bankruptcy, or if they've got some issue with substance abuse that might show up in public records. Obviously, a person is well, maybe not obviously, but I would argue that it's easy to see how a person might want to hide that from their employer, and yet at the same time, these are the very same things that might cause them to have an issue where they need to exploit the organization as a resource for them to get their own life back in order, either because they're going to sell data or leak data to try to gain stature, or some of the things that you mentioned about. And then finally, the last thing that I would argue organizations might want to spend time looking into is social media or other kinds of out-of-work but network available data that they might be able to glean from the internet. And this, again, speaks to intent. There are cases, I think it was an employee at the, I think it was DHS, actually, who a few years back was running a hate group website while he was employed at DHS. And that's the sort of thing you look at it in hindsight, and you think, well, gosh, it's sort of obvious. We should have been looking for that, and yet we weren't. And so, I would argue that having the willingness to capture that kind of information is something that organizations should absolutely consider, and it helps to be able to take those very strong, or I should say weak indicators, and then turn them through a combination of information into a stronger indicator that you can then take action on.
Now, many thanks again to Rob Kerr, Mike Krause, and Thomas Reed for sharing your unique insights on insider threats and how to combat these threats. Now, everyone in our audience, please use the contact information shown on the screen if you would like to get in touch with the presenters or request more information. Now, on behalf of Haystacks and our presenters, I'd like to say thank you to our audience for joining us today and asking great questions. I hope we will see you again at one of our future webinars. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.